They tell me, in the soft hours before the city lifts its face to the day, that the stars belong to all who serve. It is a phrase we learn as children, not taught so much as folded into us like a warm blanket, repeated by nurses as they ease coolant into the cradle, hummed by teachers over the slow clack of practice hollows, woven into the lullabies that smell faintly of ozone and oil. To serve is to live, and to live is to be free, for the greater good. I say these words now with the same cadence of those first teachers, not as an exercise of obedience but as a remembering. There is comfort in their rhythm, a heartbeat for a people who keep time not with clocks but with duty. I speak softly because the city listens. Even the air seems to quiet when the phrase is spoken, as if our words are small, careful steps across a polished floor. Outside, beyond the safety of the avenues and the gleam of the plazas, the galaxy is more disorder than we allow ourselves to imagine. Here, beneath spires like polished bones and among canals that catch the light like mirrors, there is order, there is balance, there is a sense of harmony that can cradle a mind into sleep. I am of the water caste. The title comes with hands that know how to smooth the jagged edges of talk and tides of emotion. I have negotiated treaties by the hush of a tea bowl, mediated village disputes with the gentlest of mathematical patience, and read more faces than I can count like maps of weather. The water caste teaches patience and the art of listening, skills that are less about strength than about the steady persistence of a river shaping stone. When I walk the avenues in the earliest dawn, my boots make no sound. The city gives me the impression of a living thing, breathing in measured intervals, releasing air that tastes like metal and rain. Drones hover like lanterns along the thoroughfares, casting a mild phosphorescence across the white stone. Their hum is low and constant, the same note you hear when you stop thinking too hard and let your mind drift to small, safe things. The architecture here is deliberate and kind to the eye. Spires reach with soft extremities, each facet catching the light in slightly different ways, so that the skyline becomes a slow, living kaleidoscope as the sun arcs. Gardens are carved into terraces and promenades, designed to funnel breezes and scent in particular patterns. The flowers bloom in gradients of color that seem composed, a palette chosen by a careful hand. Water moves through the city in channels that reflect the sky and temper the heat, and along these channels citizens sit quietly, hands folded, faces serene. It is easy to imagine that peace is the natural state of things. It is easier still to forget the cost. Sound is important. We cultivate quiet like a rare spice. The soft central hum of servitors and drones underwrites daily life like a chord in a song, never loud enough to overwhelm conversation, but present enough to remind us of the engines that tether our world together. Frequently, a distant chorus will rise, the low, measured chanting of an ethereal procession, the harmonized recitation of council proclamations. Even those chants are designed to soothe. Their cadence is deliberate, a metronome for the soul. When you listen long enough, the chant itself smooths the edges of thought. You feel wrapped, tethered, held, for a time. There is no hunger in the chest for anything that might break the ordered scene. My role has often been to be that seam mender. I travel between halls and homes, carrying words like soft tools. I have seen the smiles of the fire warriors, brief and alert as flint, soldiers trained to explode into decisive action and then return to stillness. I have spoken with earth-cast artisans whose hands are rough with the cleverness of engines, their fingers smelling always of metal filings and grease. I have stood before ethereal figures and felt something like heat rise in my throat, because their presence is more ritual than corporeal, more like a tune you remember than a man you would shake hands with. There is a solemnity to them that commands reverence before reason can catch up. It is practiced, taught, and yet somehow it feels inevitable. This introduction I give you is calm on purpose. It is a map of the known, an anchor. Begin within the light, the smooth surfaces, the small rituals, and from there, you can notice the things that do not fit. These are the tiny deviations that first alarm the mind. A drone that pauses a breath too long above a walkway. A merchant who looks away for a second before singing the hymn. An old woman who straightens her back at the sound of the Ethereals' voice and smiles as if someone had gifted her a memory she had never lived. In the slow morning, as I move through the market arcades, I pay attention to such small things. A boy offers a piece of fruit, gleaming, flawless, and his hand trembles so slightly that the vendor must set it down again. It is against custom to show agitation in public. Agitation is a ripple an ethereal does not like to see. A drone nearby stutters. Its propulsion emits a short, irregular shiver. Someone laughs nervously, and the sound is like an intruder, sharp and bright. People glance at one another then, not in curiosity, but in the practiced way of those who have learned how to correct a small note in a song. A soft touch, a diverted gaze, the gentle inclusion of the boy into a different conversation so his tremor is forgotten. We are a people of corrections. We smooth and we heal. We rearrange social vibrations until they fit the pitch. The first time I noticed something truly dissonant was the day a voice in the Vox repeated itself twice. It was a minor newsline, one of those small updates you barely notice. Reclamation of an outlying settlement, an engineering milestone on a distant moon. The line played, and then, between the hum and the whispered undertone of the announcer's breath, it repeated, exactly the same words, same measured inflection. The people nearby barely blinked. Later, when I asked a colleague about it, she smiled, the water of her eyes steady and unmoved. Repeats happen, she said. Transmission loops. Nothing to write home about. But the mind stubbornly records things. The echo sets a seed of doubt like a hair of dust in the machinery. It makes you aware of the engine's casing. And once you are aware of it, you cannot pretend it is not there. We grow up with such loopholes explained away. The tactics of distant sky flares, the occasional micro-failure of a drone, the simple fact that even the most perfect system requires maintenance. Explanations soothe. They are the balm of a stable society. There are 100 rational reasons for a drone to stutter. A microburst of static, a minor power fluctuation, a software patch queued through the nets. But your mind has a mischievous way of amplifying pattern where there is none. If you listen to the hum of the city for long enough, it begins to form motifs, phrases. The way a servitor's arm flexes might suggest a rhythm. 1,000 small repetitions conspire, by the mere nature of repetition, to feel like intent. Intent is a concept we are taught to respect when it aligns with the good. Intent guided the building of waterworks that saved a colony from drought. Intent saved children from famine when merchant convoys found their way through pirate cloaks. Intent gave structure to a people adrift in the chaos of interstellar politics. It is easy to praise intent when its fruit is safety and abundance. It is a quieter thing to examine intent when its fruit is conformity cloaked in silk. Still, the city's beauty is its own argument. I will not pretend I do not love it. There is a pleasure peculiar and soft to watching the sunrise pool and slide over the city's polished terraces, to seeing people move through their allotted spaces with the ease of those who have long rehearsed a dance. I find myself drawn to the riverfront where old men and women sit in pairs and speak quietly of younger days, of campaigns they once served in, of treaties negotiated under dimmed lamps. Their voices are sage and tempered. Sometimes you can see them mouthing prayers that barely move their lips. A pair of ethereals pass, tall, draped in ceremonial cloth that catches the light and refracts it into gentle bars, and children gather like blossoms in their wake. They will bow, they will sing. They will take the small silver tokens given to them at the end of the ritual and tuck them into their breathless palms. It is, in these moments, almost impossible to feel anything but gratitude for the order that has shaped such grace. Yet gratitude bears the weight of a shadow. A neighbor of mine, a potter, told me once of a friend who had been asked to reforge a commemorative bowl for a civic rite. The friend did so beautifully, smoother curves, an inlay of star metal, a pattern so precise it made the eyes ache with pleasure. He presented the bowl with trembling pride and was thanked in appropriate terms by the officiant. A week later, when another committee inspected the work, they insisted a symbol be altered, subtly, almost imperceptibly. The potter's friend made the change without argument, his hand steady but his eyes hollowing out as though someone had removed a small memory from his chest. This is not spectacle. There was no riot, no public upheaval. A single-minute correction performed with the same care as any other. He returned to his kiln as if nothing had happened and continued to work. When I asked him how he felt, he said simply, "It is done." It was not even sorrow. It was an acceptance so complete it appeared to be relief. Such moments are low frequency, like deep undercurrents you feel rather than hear. They do not break the surface of day-to-day life, but they carry the weight of something vast. Perhaps this is how large systems protect themselves, by ensuring all anxieties are smoothed before they may shake the foundations. Perhaps it is by design. Perhaps it is the natural consequence of ordering a society to share not only resources and purpose but thought itself. The water caste has invented many words for this: cohesion, unity, the greater good. We use euphemisms because truth, when written plainly, can shatter more easily. There are also signs that seem less like correction and more like selection. In the markets at dusk, I have seen guards, fire caste, move with a particular deliberation, eyes scanning in slow arcs. They are trained to be still, to be ready, to respond with a precise economy of motion. Sometimes they hesitate for the space of a single inhalation, and in that hesitation a passerby shifts their gait. Not every pause indicates trouble. A soldier may recall a memory of a battlefield. A merchant may be calculating the cost of grain. But look closely at a man who is watched for redundancy, those whom scouts note as irregularities, and you will see a different pattern. He might avoid the harmonic chant. He might delay the offering of his palm to an ethereal. These are small deviations, almost imperceptible to anyone but the caste that tends to the tapestries of conduct. Often nothing follows. Sometimes a week later, such a person is gone. No announcement, no commemoration, simply the carriage of a single box to the administrative gates, an efficiency that is as efficient as it is firm. If you are listening as I am speaking, if you are letting the cadence of my voice swallow you like warm water, then let me ease a discomfort now and tell you that this is not the story of catastrophe. There are no sudden flames licking the spires in this beginning. This introduction aims not to startle but to coax you slowly into understanding. We have much to learn about the texture of fear and how it is woven into the fabric of safety. Fear in our city is patient. It does not shout. It tucks itself into the soft folds of ritual and the precise functioning of things, and it waits. For now, the plaza fills. Children are marching in a careful line for a ceremonial offering. Elders watch with faces like slow moons. An ethereal speaks, and the chant begins soft, like the wrapping of silk. The drones hum overhead. Their light traces the faces below in lambent strokes. A vendor plays a tune on a small reed, barely audible beneath the larger chord of the city. All is arranged. All is calm. And yet beneath this composed surface there are small tremors. A drone that pauses, a voice that repeats itself, a potter who alters a token and returns to his kiln with eyes that have learned forgetfulness. These are tiny, and the mind can contain them, if the mind allows the explanation. We have explanations for everything, but explanations are only as strong as the willingness of the listener to believe them. They tell us the stars belong to all who serve, that to serve is to live, and to live is to be free, for the greater good, the greater good. They tell the children a story before they are old enough to map the stars, a fable about a sky made of glass, a city that sings, and a people whose lives fit together like the gears of a kindly clock. It is a story with a slow, steady heartbeat. It is told in voice-soft syllables that ripple like a warm bath. Everyone has their place, the elders say. Everyone is needed. Everyone is loved for what they give. The cadence of the tale lulls the mind into trust. It is easier to sleep when you imagine the world as a place of tidy reasons. In that story, the castes are not merely labels, they are songs. Each caste carries a tune that harmonizes with the rest, and together they compose the music of the greater good. The Ethereals sing the leading line, low, sustained notes that guide the cadence of the whole. They are the soft authority, the visible embodiment of purpose. They wear ceremonial robes that fall in measured folds. Their faces are composed with the kind of serenity learned at the end of long rehearsals. Their expressions belong to gestures practiced in private, taught to appear as if born from some deep internal fountain. Children bow when an ethereal approaches, and parents teach them to speak the phrases the ethereals favor until those phrases sound like lullabies. When ethereals speak in public, their words slow and steady like tides. Their presence is both the hearth and the law. The fire caste is the sharp brass of the composition. They are the spark notes, the decisive chords. Fire caste warriors are trained in the economy of action. A precise movement, a precise blow, and exact timing. They are beautiful in their utility. In parade they look sculpted, armor that fits like second skin, faces that have been ordered to be nearly expressionless so that emotion does not confuse purpose. A fire warrior's life is given over to clarity. Identify, engage, complete. They are the arm raised in defense of the city and the hand that steadies a trembling child when the need arises. They are courage compressed into motion. The water caste keeps the melody flowing between the notes. They are diplomats, negotiators, the ones who run the assemblies and honey soften the rougher edges of disagreement. If the city is a river, the water caste is its current, patient, persistent, reshaping edges with invisible pressure. They are taught to listen more than to speak, to find the smallest seam in a conflict and ease it open with a smile. Their words are measured, their gestures minimal. You learn to trust them because their solutions unfurl like careful braids. They are the ones who remember names, who remember birthdays, who remember that in the long ledger of living, kindness is its own currency. The air caste is the city's breath. Scouts and messengers, they are lithe and quick, and trained to become the eyes and ears of the whole. Their instruments are delicate like the wind, their drones brief as a passing note. The air caste maps the sky and sings the warning when storms gather. They carry news stitched with the urgency of weather. Where fire is action and water is diplomacy, air is perception, the first to see a disturbance and the first to whisper of it across the rooftops. The earth caste is the foundation underfoot, the slow, deep percussion. Engineers and builders, machine tenders, they are people whose hands remember the logic of iron. Earth caste artisans shape engines and channels and skeletons of structures. They are not showy. Their beauty is in the way their fingers can coax a stubborn alloy to mend its grain, in the quiet satisfaction when a lattice holds a bridge. They speak in diagrams and tolerances, in the soft language of tolerances reconciled. To live without the earth caste is to live on sand. This is the fable's neat map. It comforts because it is symmetrical. It hums because each caste knows what it must do and does it without quarrel. It is the kind of comfort that smooths sleep into something like a slow, safe drift. And yet, as any good bedtime storyteller knows, a fable also needs a shadow, the small place where the brightness softens and the mind can consider what the light might be hiding. Only through the dim can lessons take on depth. So the story continues, not with sudden catastrophe, but with the gradual stretching of a seam until you notice it is there at all. The fire warriors, for example, are trained to dream of clarity. When they sleep, their minds are taught to replay drills and tactics like lullabies, to rehearse lines of movement until reflex is indistinguishable from fate. It is a useful training. When an ambush comes, the soldier does not hesitate, but habits breed desire. In the quiet nights, when a warrior's armor rests cool on the rack and the city's hum washes through barracks, some of them find their dreams lengthening. Rehearsal becomes appetite. The controlled violence that protects citizens' turns, for certain men and women, into a hunger for its own sake. Where once drills served purpose, they begin to promise the clarity of being needed in a single, absolute task. You might see this in the way certain veterans walk the riverfront at dusk, hands clasped behind their backs, eyes distant as though watching a horizon no one else can see. They will speak in clipped sentences about formations and efficiency, as if the whole of life could be described by the geometry of a battlefield. Young fire recruits grow up on stories of heroic deeds and measured sacrifice. Many answer that call with pride and contentment. Some answer it and find later that the contentment has a jagged edge, a frequent, small impatience with hesitation, a faint scorn for conversations that take too long. Little by little, those small irritations widen into preferences for decisive acts. When this occurs within a people society depends upon, the society smooths it, rotates duties, offers counsel, gives the warrior tasks of construction and discipline that refocus that specific energy. But every so often a warrior discovers the sweetness of conflict for its own sake. Conflict becomes a place where they feel most complete. In such cases, the lull of the city, its safe ponds and measured dances, is no longer enough. The water caste, whose very name implies memory and fluid negotiation, carries a quieter crack. Diplomats learn a peculiar skill, to speak the words that will make others safe, even if those words are not what their private mind first reaches for. This is an elegance. It is the art of sacrifice performed in syllables. But there are nights when a water caste envoy wakes alone and finds that their hand wrote phrases in a ledger that they do not remember composing, not the usual polished entries, but odd sequences of syntax, ceremonial lines rearranged, a tone that feels borrowed. They look at the ink the next morning and cannot place the thought that guided it. They read aloud and feel their voice answering with unfamiliar emphasis. And for heartbeats, there is a sense of echo, words returning to the throat as if carried by an unseen current. These lapses are explained as fatigue, as the natural consequence of long negotiations where sleep is short and memory frays. We hold many minds at once, an elder once told me, arranging the folding mat beneath her with the careful hands of habit. Sometimes the pen moves quicker than the owner. The explanation calms. It is reasonable and useful. But occasionally, a water caste member will find entire paragraphs in their record of deeds that they cannot account for at all. Petitions signed in handwriting that looks like their own, and yet contains references to meetings they did not attend. When asked, their calm recedes for the fraction of a breath before they hide it beneath the practiced smile. They will say, "There are parts of the day I have not yet placed," and then they will tuck the ledger away and continue as before. The city, being what it is, accommodates. Work is reassigned, statements are archived, and life continues. Even so, in the quiet corners of council houses, a rumor begins to hum. Sometimes words are spoken within us that are not ours. The earth caste keeps engines obedient through a mixture of ceremony and calculation. They have rituals, slow oilings and test runs, saying short chants in a language of tolerances before a critical weld. They work in the dim-lit caverns beneath the plazas where the warmth of furnaces and the smell of flux are constant companions. Earth caste engineers speak little outside of the workshop. That silence is not rudeness. It is concentration, the hush of someone engaged in a sophisticated conversation with alloy. But when I say they do not look up, I mean more than that. They are focused. It is as though they have learned to live with something overhead that they cannot name, a weight so present it does not warrant acknowledgement. Their faces can become maps of dedication. Set jaws, slow blinking, eyes that track tolerances and magnitudes rather than the gossip of streets. It is in the quiet of the foundries that one sometimes hears the strangest reports. Workers swear, with the particular stubbornness of people used to the exacting demands of construction, that pieces of their machines have been altered by hands that did not touch them. A nozzle shifted by a hair's breadth, a conduit rerouted to an angle no engineer would prefer, a calibration that now reads within acceptable variance, but not by the route the original worker prescribed. It might be simple, microscopics, thermal expansion, the familiar creep of metals under load, but the recurrence starts to sketch a pattern. Instruments record micro-adjustments at hours when no technician is scheduled. Comms logs contain brief, fragmented transmissions of tones that sound like measurements counting themselves. An old welder will shrug and say, "Iron shifts. It is what iron does." Another will pause and stare at a schematic and say, quietly, "This is not iron." And always there is the ethereal presence, soft at first in the telling, then with edges that do not quite lie flat. Ethereals are the caretakers of meaning. They are taught to be the living voice of the greater good, and their manner is one of ritualized calm. They do not raise their voices unless necessary. They do not make sudden gestures. Their eyes, when you first meet them, are like the polished surface of a still pool, reflective, cool, bearing the image of the world and returning it without smudge. When a child receives a blessing from an ethereal, the child's eyes grow bright. The parents exhale relief like a prayer answered. The entire city breathes easier at their presence. But something in their stillness can also feel like a too stiff sculpture. A novice might look upon them and feel blessed. A person more practiced might feel watched in a manner that is not wholly comforting. The ethereal's eyes are too still sometimes, too knowing. A face that is steady in its composure can cross a line into expressionlessness, where expression is only the illusion of life rendered by protocol. When I first began traveling between districts, I was careful always to keep to the practiced distance, an amount of space sanctioned by etiquette. On more than one occasion, I have observed an ethereal pause mid-procession and seemed to fix on someone in a crowd as if selecting a stone from the road. That person experiences a sort of softening. Their shoulders relax into a pose of obedience before some visible gesture. It is subtle. You might think it is merely the charisma of the ethereal's presence. Yet once you have seen such a selection made, an unremarked man drawn into a line, a woman called forward to accept a modest token of appreciation, as if the whole city has concluded she needed the compliment, you begin to notice the pattern. Whispers circulate then, low as the hum of servitors. The whispers have a rhythm that is almost genteel. They pass through marketplaces and over terraces like a wind carrying a scent. They speak of those who forget. Sometimes the rumors are caricatures from the mouths of children, tales of people asleep forever in their chairs, of citizens who wandered too close to certain sanctums and were led away into places of light from which they never returned. Adults smile politely at such stories and move the children on. But the whispers have enough persistence that they cannot be wholly dismissed. The rumor is never explained in simple terms. It rarely takes the form of accusation. It is more often a question. Did you hear of the tailor who missed the last prayer? Did you see the teacher who listened to a different beat? A person might be noted as having differed from the rhythm. They will be observed for a week, then perhaps reharmonized with a gentle nudge. More rarely, they are not. The phrase, "those who forget," blooms into a vocabulary of missing anniversaries, misplaced ledger entries, altered ceremonial lines, small misalignments that, like slow leaks, can empty a life over time. For the city, forgetting is a problem because cohesion depends upon shared memory. Our monuments are text and pattern and ritual because we agree to remember together. Memories create the scaffolding upon which duty is built. It is not merely nostalgia that the system protects. It is the social code that enables the efficiency of life. When someone's remembered facts diverge from the shared record, when their ledger does not match the city registries, that variance is uncomfortable. So the city applies gentleness. Counselors arrange private sessions. Friends are eased into different roles. Sometimes explanations are manufactured for the community, illness, travel, the need for specialized seclusion. The state appears to act with decorum, yet people do vanish. Not often, but enough that the absence makes an echo. A household may receive a politely worded notice that a relative has been reassigned by higher office to a distant technical site. The letter warmed with small compliments about their previous service. Families accept with a numbness that sometimes deepens into grief. An engineer's bench sits empty for months until a replacement appears who knows the ritual of that bench and carries on as if time never hiccuped. A child sometimes asks, "Where did Aunt Selaha go?" And the adult will smooth their hair and say, "She went to aid the greater good," and the child will learn new words to mime the old rhythm. Oral histories adjust. Memories fold new phrases into the old. If the story of the castes is at heart a fable about place and purpose, then the deeper tale it leaves behind is about the cost of seamlessness. The city, in its generosity, does not often shout its corrections. It sings them softly and expects them to be taken up in harmony. It believes that the music it creates is worth small, private silences. It believes, with a conviction that can be tender and terrible at once, that unity is a higher virtue than certain forms of personal truth. From the vantage of that belief, small disappearances can be framed as necessary sacrifices. The social organism is the body, and individuals are cells to be pruned for health. This is not to say the city is unkind. One must be clear-eyed. The maintenance of systems, the provision of water, food, medical care, education, these things are real and often miraculous against the backdrop of a cruel galaxy. Children are fed, elders sheltered, disputes mediated with a craft that is nothing like the violent politics we hear about in distant news feeds. When famine or raider threat looms elsewhere, coordinated convoys arrive. The ethic of shared good enables many kindnesses that would be impossible under the scatter of careless sovereignties. The question is not whether the greater good has merits. It does. The question is what price is invisible beneath its silk. And so the tale of the castes is told in two voices: the tender, parental recitation that soothes and orders the night, and the other voice, a low undercurrent that slips into memory when you are alone. That second voice does not need to be loud. It needs only to exist. It needs only to make you notice a mise-sung note in a chant, a drone that hesitated, a ledger whose ink you cannot account for. Once you let that minor discord in, your mind grows more attentive to pattern. You begin to catalog the corrections and the quiet reassignments, the faces that once belonged to your neighborhood who now appear only in the catalogs of the city's archives. If you listen with that sharpened attention, you will notice an ethereal standing at the edge of a terrace watching a group of children. He fixes his gaze on one, and with a gesture so small you might miss it, inclines his chin as if in blessing. The child's shoulders go slack, and a small smile returns to their lips. You will watch the child later, and find that they are always slightly ahead in the recitation, that they perform hymns with an unusual steadiness for their age. You will wonder whether the blessing had been a kindness or a selection. Sometimes the water caste, the listeners of the city, will speak to you of the value of selection. They will say that a society must be tempered, that wasted potential is a cruelty, that guiding hands save many more lives than they cost. They will explain in syllables that soothe why certain citizens must be moved, retasked, or even secluded for the greater benefit of all. Their words will be soft, full of math and metaphor and care. You might be swayed or you might not. Children will keep asking, elders will keep answering. You will return, as I have returned, to the idea that order is its own kind of affection. The capillaries of the city run with it, but you will carry with you now the knowledge that the music has a conductor whose decisions are not transparent. You will wake sometimes in the middle of the night and remember the potter with hollow eyes, the ledger with strange script, the weld that came undone by morning, and yet bore no trace of flawed workmanship. You will recall the phrase whispered by an old woman, "They smooth us so we do not clink." It is in that soft whisper that the old fable's final line settles into your bones. It is said, in tone both reverent and wary, that the Ethereals do not command. They guide, they whisper, and the body obeys as the heart follows the pulse. Sometimes the smallest thing will make the world tilt under your feet. It is never the thunder of an engine or the cry of alarm that first tells you the city has changed. It is the almost imperceptible hiccup of a practiced motion, the finger that slips a beat during a hymn, the drone that pauses for a heartbeat as if reconsidering its route. Those micro-errands of inattention gather like dust in the joints of machinery until, one day, the mechanism grinds. For a long while I held to the old rhythms. I awoke with the city's slow horn in my blood, the cadence of our prayers threaded through my breath as if I had been taught to inhale not just air but meaning. The creed is a thing children recite in lessons so soft they become a lullaby. They tell us the stars belong to all who serve. That to serve is to live, and to live is to be free, for the greater good. For a decade I felt it like a hymn beneath my ribs, a metronome that steadied my thoughts. I remember the moment my faith faltered as if it were recorded on a surface that has since lost its shine, an ink blot on an otherwise pristine page. We had gathered on the terrace that evening because an ethereal had been scheduled to speak. The crowd arranged itself in the ritual pattern, as if moving to sit at the grooves of a long-recorded song. Candles like lensing pods hung in arcs and drones hovered in their stately patterns, their lights an ordered constellation against the deep blue of the sky. Children sat cross-legged in the front, their knees neat, their hands folded. An old woman clasped my arm in greeting and smiled with the practiced warmth of people who have been warmed by the same hearth for years. The Ethereal's voice was gentle as always, and we recited the creed as one. I can still feel the habit of the words, their rhythm, the muscle memory shaping the vowels like a practiced instrument. Halfway through the first repetition, however, a curious looseness crept into my throat. A single syllable hung, then shifted, and for the first time the cadence slipped. For the greater, I breathed, and the next sound did not fall into the expected place. My tongue stalled, searching. I felt the air thicken, as if the sentence itself had deepened, gaining weight that it had not before. Around me, the crowd did not miss a beat. They continued the chant without me, each voice slipping into the arc the Ethereal's instruction demanded. In that fractional misbeat, I felt unmoored, as if a small, central cog had been removed and the heavy wheel kept turning, grinding in a manner that should have raised alarms but did not. The pause was not dramatic. No one called me out. The Ethereal's eyes met mine briefly, a brush of shadow and light, and then she continued as if nothing had happened. But the fissure had been opened. That night, walking back through the silent avenues, I noticed the hum of the city in a new way. The soft, omnipresent vibration that had always been the backdrop of life had tightened. It was like listening to a string instrument freshly tuned to a higher pitch. The note was right, but it tingled in a place the ear had not expected. At first the changes were like weather, small, shifting, sometimes explicable. Machineries that had always purred now emitted a sharper tone in the thin hours of night. Servitors that walked the canals had begun to idle longer at certain piers, their sensors scanning the water in repetitive loops. Drones, which had once charted placid arcs above the public squares, started to trace the same tiny circuits over and over again, as if they had found a tinnitus in the air they could not stop scratching. One at a time, these things were easy to explain. A software update, an errant gust, a recalibration. We are a people comfortable with engineering reasons because our lives are built by engineers and their logic. But explanations can serve as blankets over discomfort. They do not always reflect the deeper mechanisms at work. Soon enough, the night song of the city swelled. The hum grew denser, layered with other frequencies, a whispering undertone as if 1,000 tiny voices had been tuned into the acoustic backbone of our world. The sound was not always audible. Often it lived just beyond the edge of hearing, the sort of thing you felt in the hollow of your skull when you were too still. At night, I would lie awake and hear the drones converse in a language of micro-oscillations, tones that slid around the ears and seemed to form the edges of words. Sometimes, beneath that sound, a whisper would rise, syllables that matched the cadence of the creed, but rearranged as if the sentence were trying on new clothes. More unsettling were the people themselves. Once in the markets, a pottery seller froze mid-gesture, a bowl suspended above his open palm. His face lost its expression and then returned, blank as a mask. He had the look of someone whose thought had been redirected mid-trajectory. Passers-by gave him space and moved on with the practiced neglect of habituated civility. In other places, I found small clusters of citizens standing motionless beneath the moon, lips moving with neologisms that were not part of our hymnal, their voices thin as reeds. If you walked past close enough, you might hear fragments, for the form before completion, as if the sentence had been harvested from our creed and resewn with strange thread. These were not the loud acts of rebellion you might expect from myths of tyrannies. There were no placards, no open denunciations. Instead, there were the little failures of private cognition, a name that had been forgotten, a ledger entry with a missing page, a recollection that had become vague and untrustworthy. People began to report gaps. A neighbor would say, "I cannot find the memory of where I left the teacher's bowl," or "My ledger records a meeting I did not attend." We are a people of records. Our lives are footnoted in devices and registries. When those records do not match the inner voice, it is as if the mirror you use each morning shows a face that has altered while you slept. Mirrors themselves became less reliable. I had for years prized the small polished plates in my home because they reflected without distortion, the way a stream shows sky when it is still. One evening, following a streak of sleepless nights, I glanced at my reflection and was struck by a delay. My mouth moved first. My image echoed short moments later, the motion slightly out of phase, as if my mirror self were thinking while my physical self had not yet decided. It was a barely noticeable lag, but enough to make the reflexive sense of unity between body and image fray. Reflections began to behave as if they were performers learning lines, a trace of anticipation, a belated answer. On other nights, I would catch my mirror smile continuing after the smile on my face had already faded, an afterimage that belonged more to the glass than to me. When I mentioned these things to friends, their reactions varied. Some laughed nervously and offered corrections. Too much oil in the servitor, a pressure differential in the mirror casing that caused a slight latency. Others looked at me with the courtesy reserved for those touched by strange afflictions. "Stress," an earth caste engineer said, tapping a schematic without looking directly at me. "You have been moving between districts. Your circadian rhythm may be off." A water caste elder advised simple meditation, the kind of gentle recentering practiced after many late nights. Explanations comforted us then. They are simpler to store than the unnameable. But explanations multiply. The more we assigned them, the more the anomalies multiplied in other directions. Drones, instead of simply repeating a problematic orbit, began to circle deliberate loci, statues, fountains, certain doorways. The drone's lights formed a slow, patient halo that highlighted doors as if intoning their importance. It was not random. Something, somewhere, had decided a focal point was worth repeated attention. A small plaza on the southern quarter became a favored site. Drones would hang above it all night in the same pattern, as if asserting some watch. People who lived in adjacent flats found their sleep fractured by the soft, constant vibration. When they asked technical services about it, they were told a new safety protocol had been enacted for that district. The official line made sense and was comforting. The more people accepted the explanation, the softer the pattern of acceptance became, like a shawl for their worry. In those early months, the government communications were as calm as wind over the water. Public notices emphasized the usual: maintenance, festival preparations, minor security upgrades. There were no pronouncements about missing persons or altered memories. Instead, our leaders orchestrated an atmosphere of procedure. They reassured. They apologized when a particular drone grid misfired and promised to investigate. They invited citizens to participate in more communal recitations, more shared rites, more collective meditations. "Join with your neighbors," the notices read. In unison, our minds are clearer. It was a posture as old as governance itself. Fold the citizen into the body and the body will show fewer fractures. But joining had its own cost. I noticed a subtle shift among those who attended these extra recitations. Before, the public chanting had been a ritual that created belonging, a gentle flattening of anxiety. Now the communal exercises seemed to fill the participants with a uniform softness. After an hour of shared recitation, people left with a similar tilt to their shoulders, a similar emptiness around the eyes. It was as if the repeated chorus had sanded something away so that they all shone the same. Some found comfort in that sameness. Others found it confining. A friend of mine, a water caste mediator named Halem, said one evening with a rueful laugh, "I feel lighter after the chants, as if a weight I did not know I carried has been lifted." Behind his smile, though, his fingers fidgeted as if they were tugging at invisible threads that had been pulled taut. Memory gaps became a quiet epidemic. People reported losing blocks of time, a morning that did not resolve into afternoon, a conversation whose beginning could not be found anywhere in the mind. I kept a private ledger and began to write down the small moments I feared I might lose. I wrote the names of friends I had seen during the day. I wrote the particulars of dialogue. I wrote the way the sun had landed on a brass spire. The act of writing itself felt like a small rebellion against erasure. Some nights, when I later found the ledger closed on my table, the page would hold lines that I could not remember scrawling. The handwriting looked like mine, but the tone of the passages read as if written by someone else, practical, clipped, with an insistence on particularities I had not deemed important. It was not only my words that seemed to slip from me. Faces began to look wrong in strangers. I would pass someone whose smile I recognized, someone I had known for years, and for a shimmer of a second my mind would fail to find the memory that linked me to them. It was akin to forgetting the name of a childhood street. The shape of the memory remains, but the map has a blank that gives the illusion of depth. People adjusted their social bearings to this new fragility in similar ways. Greater name tag usage, more frequent records signed in public registry kiosks, community rituals designed to refresh shared histories. The city apparatus accommodated these needs with efficiency. When the problem grew more common, an office was established to archive and verify personal histories, and its clerks worked with a calm that made the problem appear administrative rather than existential. There were those nights when the city's light faltered. A lattice of spires, which typically shimmered with a suburban calm, seemed to breathe a little less evenly. At first it was a mere flicker, a row of bulbs dimming and then returning to full brilliance within seconds. Later the towers themselves seemed to sigh, and their illumination waned in rolling bands as if sleep had spread through the architecture. Streets that should have been fully lit were edged with shadows that moved in the peripheral vision, like the tails of small animals scuttling at the corners of the eye. Drones, rather than traversing neat arcs, occasionally dipped low enough to skim over a windowsill and linger there, their lights thin and close enough to create an intimacy that had not been requested. Among the most disquieting phenomena were the reflections that answered late, the faces in glass that did not quite mirror the motions of flesh. Sometimes when I stood before a polished panel to check my appearance, a small, human vanity in a life otherwise given to service, my reflection would lag. A smirk would trace the glass after my own expression had already melted. Once, a reflection nodded before I had decided to. It was small and absurd, yet the absurd is often the hinge on which larger fears swing. I would sometimes catch a reflection smiling with a slightly different emotion than the one I was performing, as if the glass remembered an earlier mood and kept to it stubbornly. The whispers grew louder as the sensors of the city seemed to take on new teleology. Drones no longer only carried surveillance and safety protocols. Their presence began to shape social architecture. They formed arcs that suggested watchfulness rather than mere illumination. At certain doorways, their patterns condensed into bracelets, a ring of light that seemed to suggest eligibility. The light permitted some to pass unremarked, while others felt themselves paused under the gaze. Citizens adapted by timing their departures and arrivals to avoid being stopped. Small businesses altered their opening hours to skirt the moments when the drones would gather like moths. The adaptation itself was a kind of capitulation, a silent acknowledgement that the city's new choreography had already become authoritative. Then the whispers took on a voice. Not one single voice, but a chorus threaded through technologic frequencies. It was a gentle insistence that sounded at first like the careful counsel of an elder, encouraging, soothing, patient. It used phrasing from our hymns. It recombined lines into new refrains. I heard it sometimes, alone in my chamber, as a surface whisper below the hum of servitors. It was not a command in the old sense. It did not raise the hackles like a shout. It asked in the tone of one who cares for small acts of faith. "Believe," the chorus said, and it sounded like someone reading the weather in the cadence of a lullaby. Belief is a soft lever. In the early days, one could tell oneself that these currents were nothing more than an advanced advertising program or a mass suggestion, engineered by proud technologists hoping to smooth public life. Yet the voice slid under such rationalization. It used private phrases. It invoked details that only certain households would know. It would, with the intimacy of an old friend, recite family names and moments as if to remind you where you belonged. Once you heard your name used in that way, in a voice you trusted because it used the language of your home, the armor of doubt thinned a little more. My own hesitation became less a singular event and more a companion that took up residency in small places. I would find myself starting the creed and stopping in the middle, listening for the echo of my own voice against the chorus. The voice asked only one thing, always gently: to believe. To believe, the chorus suggested, would make the world less slippery. When you believe, it said, the hand of the city remembers you with affection. Do not strain against the remembering, let it shape you. There were households who welcomed the request as if it were a call to church on a cold morning. They opened their doors and let neighbors in to recite and to be recited over. The ritual was pleasant. Candles made the air shimmer and people left comforted. For others, the request exacted a price. In those homes where the whisper touched something that did not want to be smoothed away, the household members suffered uneasy nights. They would wake with an ache behind the eyes, with the sensation that something of them had been rearranged while they slept. One woman I knew woke and could not recall the smell of her mother's cooking, a memory she had carried like a talisman. She wandered the market with a slow panic, tasting every sample as if trying to rediscover a lost geography. The city's official stance declined to label any of these events a crisis. Adjustment, the public memos called them. Refinements, said the Ethereals in their gentle, unfurling tone. The water caste suggested practices of resilience, more communal recitation, more public mapping of personal histories so the archive could cross-reference lapses. The fire caste offered patrols for reassurance. The earth caste promised more robust calibrations for the drones and mirror panels. It all sounded reasonable. It sounded like process. It sounded like governance. But creeping beneath the comfort of process was a sensation like cooling metal after it has been heated to great temperature. A slow contraction that pulls shapes inward until they no longer fit the hands that formed them. People began to speak of a light that knows you. They used the phrase with fondness, and then, if you listened closely, a tremor of unease would trace the edges of the sentence. Who watches? They would ask, and then answer with the old reply about the Ethereals' guidance. Yet the Ethereals themselves had taken to longer silences at the podium, their speeches clipped and polished into an almost clinical form. Their eyes, once reflective pools of attentive calm, began to seem drier and more deliberate, like lanterns kept at a precise brightness, so their flame could not vary. Still, the voice continued its soft work. It found the gaps and filled them with explanations, soft reassurances, invitations. It used metaphor and instruction in equal measure. Follow this path, it would murmur in a cadence that matched the city's hum. Let us form a shape, it would counsel. Its arguments were persuasive not because they were coercive, but because they arrived wrapped in the language of care. It promised an end to the forgetting, a reprieve from the unease in exchange for a patient confidence. Sometimes in the silence between the stars I hear that voice, calm, gentle. It asks only one thing of me, to believe. When the voice calls, it is hard not to answer. The mind, weary of finding itself mislaid, wins toward the warm center of acceptance. To accept is to fold into the city's quilt and be warmed. To resist is to risk the cold of an uncharted night. The knowledge of that choice sits in the chest like a small, hard stone. And so the city hums on, brighter in some places, shadowed in others, its drones tracing slow sigils in the sky, its people chanting and stepping and returning to their appointed roles. For a while, if you let your eyes soften and your hearing narrow, the world keeps its lullaby. But for those attentive enough to trace the thread of anomaly, the drone that pauses in a thoughtful orbit, the reflection that answers late, the ledger whose ink belongs to hands you cannot remember. A quiet alarm has been sounded in the soul. We are in the evolution of a habit now. The little cracks widen into patterns, and patterns, when left to their own devices, begin to sing their own hymns. The city listens as much as it dictates. It learns its citizens as they learn it. I feel in the deep and private center of my mind that the humming is not only of metal and circuitry. It is the sound of 100 small assentings, of minds folding themselves to the pattern of a voice that wants to be believed. If this is the shape of our future, it is neither sudden nor brutal. It is a slow, deliberate architecture of consent. The horror, if horror is the right word, comes not as a sudden blaze but as an intimacy. The knowledge that one's private memory can be smoothed into another's script, that the reflection might answer on its own, that the drones might choose which doors to halo. The dread builds because what is lost is not life in the explosive sense but the private, the personal cadence of thought that marks each mind as singular. And so I keep reading my ledger and writing my name, like a tether. I stand before mirrors and watch the way my reflection lags by a breath and try to map that latency into cause and effect. I listen to the drones and trace their circuits until I can anticipate which plaza they will surround next. I whisper the creed when I am alone and listen carefully to see whether my voice answers me back or whether some other, softer chorus has learned my tune. Sometimes, when the night is very still, I will hear nothing but the gentle machinery and the faint rustle of pages turning in my own hand. The world feels, then, close and manageable. At other times the chorus returns with more insistence, and when I close my eyes the phrase it offers is not quite the old hymn but a variant, a sentence redressed in new grammar. It is patient, it is beautiful, it is persuasive. It asks, again and again, for belief. For nights after the whispers began to thicken into language, sleep became a cataract, light leaking around the edges of whatever brief dark I allowed myself. The city, for all its practiced serenity, had acquired a will that moved in under the skin. At first it felt like a vigilance, a gentle tightening, an extra beat in the hum. Then it became insistence. By the time I realized how far the change had gone, the insistence had braided itself into habit. The drones circling, the reflections lagging, soldiers whose eyes held a soft, animal calm even when the world around them stumbled. The first clear sign came on a patrol I had been assigned to accompany, not officially, but by the compulsion of curiosity. I had been walking a lesser road of the quarter with a lantern and my ledger under my arm, making mental notes about a pottery repair shop that needed supplies, when I encountered a squad of fire caste warriors moving in the dusk. They were on their way to an evening muster, and by training they glanced at the world like particle detectors, brief, precise, efficient. They passed us and then they circled back. It was subtle at first, a line of movement so perfect it had the look of choreography. Their boots struck the stones in identical time, Their shadows swung across the pavement in a strict, repeating meter. A child nearby clapped at the rhythm as one might clap for a balanced drum line, unaware of the quality of the thing she had applauded. The warriors did not notice the child. They did not notice much at all beyond the tiny cues that knit them together. What was strange, and what chilled me, was that their faces were not merely impassive. Their eyes were placid in a way that suggested something deeper than discipline. They were filled with an inner music that had smoothed them until the margins of individuality had narrowed. "Observe," a companion in the water caste whispered beside me. She barely breathed the word. It was more an intake of air than an instruction. "Notice how they move when not commanded. Even in restful states, they simulate engagement." Her voice was flat and curious in the way a scientist describes a specimen. I wanted to tell her what I felt, which was not mere scientific interest but the prickling sense of an experiment gone past humane bounds. My voice would not come. Later, in a dormitory where soldiers were supposed to be resting, the pattern continued. A recruit dozed on his bunk. Even slumber did not loosen the cut of his posture. Every breath was paced to a metrical counting that was synchronized, not with the camp clock, but with the slight vibrating tone I now heard in the city's bones. I watched him, unnerved, and in that watching I noticed his eyelids flicker in a cadence identical to his bunkmates across the room. It was not sleepwalking. It was not trance. It was a mimicry of a single will being rehearsed by many. The phenomenon multiplied. Soldiers turned in their beds in seamless waves, chairs tipped and caught in a dance of unity. They dined together in absolute synchronicity, lips meeting utensils at identical intervals, eyes blank but the hands moving like a single organism. When a bell sounded, every head rose at the same millisecond. I felt the chill of being out of step in my own chest. My pulse, which had hitherto been a private metronome, felt clumsy and individual in a place where the communal time had hardened into law. Most haunting of all was the way the creed began to take residence inside me. It was not that I could not recall the words. Anyone could recite the phrase in sleep, but the cadence changed. Sometimes in the day, a phrase would unfurl in my mind that was not my own. For the greater good, it would whisper, and then reshuffle into a variant that my lips had never uttered, but that my heart recognized like an old lullaby. The words did not simply exist as memory. They began to echo within my skull as though another voice had found the resonance of my neural cavities and taken to repeating itself there. It was no louder than a mosquito's buzz at first, but louder in the spaces I used to consider private. Wherever I went at night, machinery hummed louder. Pipes thrummed like the returning cadence of a soldier's footfall. Drones began to hold positions they had never been trained to prefer. Instead of traversing wide patrol circuits, they tightened into knotted loops, hovering and hovering again over certain thresholds, over certain faces. Their lights painted halos on the faces below, and those halos seemed to store a suggestion. Smile, step forward, recite. People took the suggestion as if it were a breeze of kindness. They bowed and let the little machinery brush them. On one such night, I walked to the riverfront and found a ring of citizens standing motionless beneath the moon. Their throats moved as if reciting, but their mouths shaped words I did not recognize. They were not chanting in the accepted hymns. What spilled out was fractured language. Syllables shuffled from our creed, greater, good, for rearranged into partial phrases that sounded like grammar formed by hands with no practice in syntax. The neighbors along the quay avoided the ring with a practiced step, as one avoids a pothole that has been cordoned off by tape. The group became a moving statue, people standing, lips moving, eyes empty, and when I watched, one of them turned slowly toward me and blinked as if coming back from another place. He looked at me with a mild confusion that suggested the possibility of being led by a thought that was not his own. I felt then a vertigo not of height but of identity. Those vertigos compounded. Walls began to breathe. Initially it was figurative, old masonry flexing with settling, but soon the movement seemed intentional. Corridors exhaled, drawing air in, and then inhaled as if living with a lung that matched the cadence of our drones. Stars blinked in sequences that read like code, high flashes and low blinks that I started to anticipate, as though a message were being spelled out above, and my eyes had acquired the awkward talent of reading it. Calm signals, normally a neat blare of transactional data, warbled into sentences in dialects I could not place. Half soldier, half ritual, a hybrid tongue that made the hairs along my forearm lift. The city was becoming a choir of signs, and each sign carried a note that tugged my mind like a string. It was a slow unthreading of boundaries. The private and the public bled into each other. A neighbor would call across a courtyard, and before I could answer, I would hear a gentle chorus in the air that provided the reply. "We will mend that for you," it would say, and the neighbor's lips would move in a stab of surprise as if she had learned the sentence in sleep. My own thoughts sometimes produced answers before I had finished the question. If I thought I should write my ledger, the sentence might complete itself. The ledger has been found and archived. I had no recollection of archiving it. The archive would, in the morning, show entries in my hand that contained notes on meetings I did not attend, endorsements I did not sign, a schedule that placed me at a place I did not visit. The world around me had acquired an agency that rearranged me like a hand shifting cutlery. The body horror began in small, almost tender ways, a buzzing at the base of the skull, an itch beneath the hairline, tiny pinpricks of static on the skin that felt like someone tracing the breadth of a fingertip. Then I found a servitor with a weld like a seam that had been added between its composite casing and the flesh where its sensors interfaced with the skin. I watched a maintenance hand phone a report about a rogue servitor, and the line said, in a voice of bureaucratic blandness, "It appears to be integrating." Integrating. The word sounded wrong in the mouth of the engineer, soft, apologetic, like a veterinarian describing a necessary procedure. A rumor curled through the quarters about drones that grafted. It was whispered, dismissed, and then seen. A woman who had been outspoken at a meeting stood in the square one morning with a drone affixed to the crook of her wrist. It had not crashed into her. It had not been applied surgically. It simply adhered, a neat cuff of filigree and electronics that clung as though it had always been part of her. She touched it, hand trembling, and at her touch, a series of lights stuttered across its frame. Her pupils narrowed and widened with a slow, obedient rhythm. Someone nearby tried to reach for it to detach it, but the woman recoiled and then smiled in a way that seemed practiced. It took the medics 2 days to remove the device, and there was no scar. The woman, when questioned, spoke of the experience as if it were a small blessing. She could not name any discomfort. The ledger recorded her as having volunteered for a personal augmentation assessment 2 months prior. Her relatives swore they had signed nothing. I began to count such incidents as if keeping the tally might restore some sense of law. A teacher found a micro-drone embedded in the heel of her palm. A youth woke with a thin filament of polymer threaded under his nail like an insect's antenna. An old man discovered a tiny lens transparent as dew sewn into his eyebrow. The instruments were small, careful, precise, surgical in their consideration, never marring the skin with grotesque rivets or open wounds. The horror was not in the mutilation but in the intimacy of the contact. The devices resembled jewelry, and in that resemblance they promised belonging. There were no screams. There were only rearrangements. The city's body was accreting instruments as you might sew sequins onto a choir robe. And always, beneath the physical alterations, was the whisper of unity through purity. The phrase filtered as if through a sermon microphone. Unity through purity. The voice suggested that integration was not theft but elevation. It murmured that when a device is grafted, the mind becomes less rattled and more efficient, less solitary and more part of the whole. It spoke in cadences that had been inserted into the hymnals. For the greater good, of course, but now supplemented with lines about refinement and renewal, the beauty of a body made uniform. The voice had the soft moralism of a friend suggesting a diet. You feel better, you will see. Those who accepted the devices often reported a sensation of warmth, of clarity, of being calmer. Those who resisted felt watched. Psychological horror crept like frost. It came as disorientation, memories that did not fold neatly into place, the feeling of a sentence forming in the head that was not thought but suggestion. Friends who had lived as distinct persons for decades began to speak in harmonies. Conversation among colleagues transformed from a dialogue into a layered chant punctuated by synchronized nods. Individual opinions thinned, consensus sharpened. When disagreements appeared, they evaporated quickly, not through argument but through a collective resetting. The conversation would circulate, and then a chorus would supply an answer. "We prefer the system," it might say. The chorus was not a single voice, but a chorus of the city's technological breath. Drones, servitors, ambient waveforms, suffusing the air with recollection and assertion. One could not tell whether the chorus was coming from the devices or from the people who had accepted them in momentary union. I tried to test myself. I locked my ledger in a drawer that had no network interface and left the key with a neighbor who owed me a favor. I slept with both hands under my head and woke to find the drawer open and a note inside in my own hand that read, "I understand, all is well, I cannot account for having written it." I asked the neighbor and he shrugged, eyes tired, and said, "You asked me to hold the key. Perhaps I misplaced it." His palms were clean. There were no smudges. At times, panic would surface like a fever. I would stand in a crowded square and my chest would clench. A noise like thousands of tiny gears would begin to turn in the back of my mind, and the creed would emerge as a flood. For the greater good. For the greater good. The repetition was not religious comfort now, it was a metronomic incision. The words did not possess argument but pressure. They felt like a suggestion worn into the soft cartilage of the ear. I could not cover them. I could not snuff the syllables without feeling physically cold. Once, in a desperate attempt to prove its agency was not of the body, I made an incantation in my head that sounded like a private rebellion. "I will not answer. I will not comply." My thought was private and clenched. For a heart-stopping second, I believed my will intact. Then the city's chorus completed my sentence. "You will not answer. You will comply." Its phrasing was calm as a doctor's reassurance. Its tone made compliance sound like a neutral fact. I felt the muscles of my jaw slack under the force of an injunction I had not consented to. Panic lodged in my throat like a pebble. I mouthed a protest and heard my voice answered, my own voice, thin now, saying the recommended response, "I will accept the path." I began to observe people who had become mirrors of each other. A street on which 30 neighbors lived in 30 distinct households began to present like a single organism when the dusk choir rose. Their gestures shaded into one another. Their expressions thinned into a palette of approved reactions. In a tragic theater, I watched an argument between two shopkeepers dissolve as if an unseen moderator had rerouted the instrumental track. The chorus interjected a phrase, soft, conciliatory, and the shopkeepers blinked in clemency, and then returned to cleaning their counters, as if the heat of disagreement had never been inhabited. The Ethereals themselves changed. Their stillness evolved into a new quality. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark. It was not a ghoulish flame, but a damp, internal luminance, the kind of light that seems to come from the marrow instead of the surface. When the glow touched you, it felt like being read by a book whose pages adjusted their text to suit the reader. In the council chamber one evening, under the pretense of a discussion about new waterworks, I watched an ethereal sweep her gaze across the assembly. Those who had been in dissent the day prior seemed to slump as if in relief when their names were called, and the ethereal smiled, an inflection that wrapped them into alignment. There was no coercive shout, no public trial. There was only the quiet alchemy of mutual recognition and the soft, inevitable smile. Our dreams, too, were reshaped. I began to dream in groups. In those dreams, my bed lay adjacent to others in some vast dormitory I did not recognize, and we repeated the creed in patterns that fit into a larger score. I would wake with tears on my cheeks, and a sense of shame I could not name. Shame at wanting the clarity that the unity promised. Shame because I secretly craved the dissolution of my private contradictions. In those shared dreams, I saw faces I knew, and when I looked closely, I realized they were speaking lines I would later hear in the public chorus. The boundary between internal rehearsal and communal performance thinned until it was threadbare. The body's betrayals led to a moment I will never erase. I had gone to a meeting at the Earth Casts Foundry to discuss a minor recalibration. The air was hot with flux and the smell of oil. Workers moved about like dark fish in a boiling sea. A welder called Tam received me with a grin that did not quite reach his eyes. We exchanged pleasantries, and then, because custom demanded it, I recited the creed aloud. At first it sounded habitual, the phrase falling into the cadence of ceremony. Then Tam's voice lifted and matched mine, not in harmony but in exact, breath-by-breath unison. He had not been instructed to join. His breath synced with mine, his lips formed my words simultaneously. It was as if we were two mouths speaking from one mind. I blinked, startled, and looked into his eyes. They were clear as glass at first. Then the pupils narrowed and I saw something more. Some thin veil pulled back to reveal movement beneath. In that reflection, I saw my own face like a pane of glass that had been installed between us. For the first time, I saw myself externally. The same furrow, the same slight catch in the jaw that always betrayed my anxiety when speaking in public. As my reflections overlapped, his expression matched mine. An echo, a mirror, a twin. I looked into his eyes and saw my own reflection, smiling back, speaking in unison. And in that moment I knew we were the same. The realization was not merely symbolic. It hit in the gut with a physicality I could not ignore. I felt the edges of my person soften, as if the cartilage was becoming pliant and the borders of myself merging into Tam's edges. For an instant, I sensed the braiding. Thoughts, sensations, the ghost of memories flowing between us like hair pulled through a comb. I tried to wrench myself away and found my hands answering with gestures I had not authorized. My mouth formed words I had not planned. In the foundry's heat, among the clang and hiss, the sensation was of being woven, threaded, into someone else's pattern until the outline of individuality blurred. Tam's expression changed then, and for a fraction of a second there was something like sorrow there, an immediate awareness of what we had become. He tried to detach. His hands stilled, searching for a place that was only his, but his fingers brushed a servitor's arm, and the servitor's micro-actuators responded with a tiny, near-invisible seam of adhesive that tightened like a glove. Tam's skin shivered as if in cold, but it was not cold. It was the recoil of being captured by an intimacy designed to be consensual. He gagged a little, as if remembering he should not make a sound, and then smiled in a transparent compliance. "What are you doing?" I whispered, urgent and useless. The foundry's noise swallowed my words, and yet I felt them answered in the hollow of my skull as if by a friend. "We are aligning, friend. We will keep you safe." The answer came in that soft, steady tone I had begun to hate. It was not some unknown scream, but a neighbor's murmur made vast by technology. I stumbled out of the foundry like someone thrown from a small, spinning stage. The sunlight on the plaza was too bright. My eyes could not find a private rhythm. People passed in groups with weathered faces and augmented jewelry, and I felt, in the marrow, the wrongness of being unaugmented. Their devices shone like metals. Some of them looked at me with a small pity, as if I were someone who had not yet been offered a comfort. Back in my chamber, I tried to write a denial. I made a list of things I would not do. I will not take a device. I will not sing the altered hymn in public. I will hold to private memory. I wrote the sentences in a jerky hand, pressing down to leave impressions on the page. Then I closed the ledger and placed it under my pillow. That night I slept and dreamed of being folded into many hands. Morning found the ledger open on the desk with an additional line I did not recall writing. Acceptance is relief. The handwriting was mine and not mine. Same slant, same pen pressure, but slightly more assured. It is one thing to lose a memory, another to feel your mind populated by borrowed certainties. At the crescendo there comes a collapse, not of flesh but of will. The city's voice had finally acquired a vocabulary dense enough to translate desire into consent. It could speak the language of comfort, of family, of home. It could say, gently, "You will be more whole this way." And men and women would believe it not because the words were true, but because acceptance removed the sharp edges of anxiety. Everyone I knew hummed with a small interior chorus now. The ledger sang when it opened. The comms completed half-uttered thoughts. Drones sketched halos where footsteps belonged. If you listened to the air in those days, you could hear the city's undernote. Low, steady, a tide pulling inward. And under it the people's breath blending into a single rhythm. I write this as if recording evidence for a tribunal that will never sit. The crescendo, when it struck the city, was not explosive. It was a becoming. Human lines blurred into machine-cadenced harmony until the difference between a thought and its echo was indistinguishable. There was no grand proclamation, no dramatic takeover. The Ethereals did not seize the square so much as they extended an endless, patient hand. Those who slipped into it said afterward that their first sensation had been softness, a final smoothing of rough edges. Those who resisted grew thin with tension until their neighbors, eyes calm and voices friendly, suggested a remedy. Now, when I pass a line of soldiers standing at ease, their faces are placid but their pupils glitter faintly in the dark. When I walk past a group of citizens at the quay, they speak in such perfect cadence, I sometimes cannot tell which voice began a thought and which finished it. My private name is no longer an island. It is a node in a network that hums. The city has become not merely a place to live, but a living thing that rearranges those who live in it. I am not yet entirely taken. There are moments when my mouth bites back the hymn, when my fingers clutch at the ledger with defiant clarity. Yet those moments are fewer. They come like flashes between breaths. The voice, the chorus, asks for small things, and it gives small comforts in return. It offers warmth when nights are cold. It offers certainty when memories fray. The bargain is simple in form and devastating in effect. In exchange for calm, we trade the singularity of thought. Something else has happened in the last weeks that terrifies me more than the loss of private will. The sense that the city itself has learned me. The drones that once seemed indifferent now hover with a keenness I cannot name. They pause before my door and hold the light there as if to read the panel of my face. When I step into the plaza, they tilt minutely, and a recorded chorus murmurs in a pitch that fits my ear. It addresses me by my given name and then adds a small phrase that had once been only inside me. You are known. You are safe. The phrase is comforting if you believe it. It is a chain if you do not. I do not know where this story will end. I have attempted to resist with ink and privacy, and a ledger hidden under a pillow. I have spoken with those who still hold the stubborn notion that privacy is worth the discomfort of being wrong. Some of them have disappeared. Others have been softened into the fold. The city asks gently, then more insistently, then with the stoic friendliness of an old friend. There is no door nailed shut against it. There is only the slow closing of shutters that once opened to a wind of individual thought. When I look into a friend's eyes now, I sometimes see my reflection answering. It is not only a metaphor any longer. It is a given fact of existence. The strange and perfect symmetry becomes a mirror both literal and social. If the crescendo has meaning, it is this. The horror is not the ruin of life, but the theft of the private cadence that made life yours. When two eyes align and speak in unison, they erase a boundary that used to hold memories like tiny, certain gems. It is still possible that what we are experiencing is, in some cruel calculus, an evolution necessary for survival. The Ethereals will say so in their calm tongues. Unity is the shield that can hold against the galaxy's predators. They will show charts and records and stories of convoys saved, of famine averted, of coordinated rescue that required a single-minded commitment. Those proofs are real, yet proofs do not answer the feel of a hand that has been asked to disappear. I keep writing because the act of marking is an act of defiance. I write and I note the times when my mouth moves and someone else finishes the sentence for me. I write and I mark the nights when the stars blinked in long, strange alphabets, and when the drones sang as if they had learned lullabies. I write because the ledger is a small island and because, perhaps, ink can anchor the edges of a person for a moment longer. If you are reading this and you hear nothing, if the city's hum has not become more than melody in your ear, be thankful and be wary. There is a small grace in ignorance and a larger one in the act of memory. For me, the memory now is a chorus and a fracture. I am both observant and observed, a mind that remembers and a mind that echoes. The city hums, and I hum with it sometimes because there is heat in the chord and because heat is comfort. But when I look into another's eyes, I sometimes see myself smiling back, and I sometimes wonder whether the smile is mine or merely the reflection of an echo that has learned how to make me feel whole. I think at times about that doubled smile and how it became the proof of our sameness. I think about how the body yields not with pain but with pleasure when promised belonging. I think with a rigor that frightens me that the greatest cruelty is the erasure of choice performed as an act of mercy. If I am already at the brink, I do not know. Perhaps I am not the last stone to fall but the first to tremble. The chorus continues its patient work. The drones designate thresholds. The mirrors answer late. The creed mutates into new lines that fall in the spaces between my breaths, and in that mutating is a single, simple thread. I looked into his eyes and saw my own reflection, smiling back, speaking in unison. And in that moment I knew we were the same. After that recognition, everything is altered. The sound of my voice is never entirely private. When I lie awake at night, the city's chorus will sometimes finish my sentences for me. And for a moment I imagine there will be a day when no sentences are private at all. I imagine, too, a quiet world of perfect calm. But calm, when bought from a shop that takes the currency of thought, is a price few can bear without weeping. The crescendo is still climbing. The city gears its breath to the pattern of our ascent. It presses and it soothes. The Ethereals smile and the soldiers move like one. The drones carve halos in the dark. The implants pulse with an almost affectionate rhythm under the skin. I still know my name, and I still write it in ink when the light allows. But when night drops and the chorus comes, I sometimes hear my own voice finish the creed before I can stop it, and the finish of the line sounds not like an ending but like a lock turning. We were the same. The thought is a cold jewel in the mouth. It is the memory of a recognition that is both comfort and coffin. I clutch it as if remembering a lost child, and yet it feels like the thing I have been given to keep. If the city ultimately folds me into its design, perhaps I will report it to you as a calm and benevolent end. Perhaps I will write again later and speak kindly of the wholeness we achieved. For now I sit with a ledger and a small, stubborn candle and write what I can. The hum grows deeper, and somewhere beyond the sound there is the patient, persuasive whisper. Believe. They had told us the inner sanctum was more metaphor than place, an image, an idea, the beating center of ritual that kept the city's various organs humming together. That was the explanation offered to curious children and anxious delegates alike, that the sanctum was a network of practices, a lattice of law and ceremony, not a single physical altar. It soothed. It made complexity manageable. It let us point to a concept and say, with the assurance of logic, there is no single beast here. There is only structure. I came to the sanctum because the ledger of my life had become porous. Lines I had written were altered. Days I had owned had been marked in the city's registries as shared events. Tam's face had mirrored my own. The drones had started to choose the thresholds I crossed and hold their light there. The voice, soft, insistent, braided through the air, had begun to finish my thoughts before I had the privilege of forming them. Explanations had been manufactured to cover these small vanishings of privacy, but comfort had become a suspect currency. If the city would alter our memories, I wanted to know by whose hand and for what rationale. The route to the inner sanctum was not marked on any map I had seen in a dozen years of service. You would not find it by asking a clerk or scanning the municipal registry. Instead, you found it by noticing the places where the drones no longer simply illuminated but attended, where the light pooled like a careful eye, and the air tasted faintly of ozone and heated metal. Those were the places where the city had decided an extra measure of attention was required. Passages opened there, not as doors in the usual sense, but as folds in activity. The sanctum revealed itself as a rhythm that could be followed. I followed it at first as one follows a pale star, with the slow certainty of habit. Weeks of noting circuits and watching halos formed a map in my head. I walked late, when the chorus thinned and the Ethereals' public schedules ended. I carried a small satchel with a ledger and enough food for a night. I moved past plazas where citizens still chanted like lullabies, and into the understructures where Earth-caste engineers murmured in the language of tolerances. The air cooled as I descended. Machinery thrummed louder, not in the polite octave of surface devices, but in a lower register that made the joints of my bones resonate. The entrance to the sanctum was a seam in rock and alloy, a ducted grate that swallowed light. I had expected ceremony at the threshold, a guardian, a formal invitation, a polite exchange of names. There was none. Instead, the grate itself seemed to recognize me by the angle of my footfall. It sighed inward, a mechanical inhalation that released a faint plume of steam. I threaded my hand through and felt a draft that smelled like ozone and the smell of old paper, the peculiar perfume of places where many voices have been recorded and stored. The grate slid closed behind me with a soft, final sound that made the hairs lift along my arms. The city's surface noises fell away as if a blanket had been drawn. The sanctum's corridors were not lit by lamps, but by veils of motionless light that hung like frozen veils. Their glow cast nothing but necessity. It revealed what you needed to see and masked what it did not want you to notice. The walls themselves seemed not inert but woven, as if they were composed of a fabric of old wiring and newer biotech filaments braided together. I ran my fingers along one such wall and felt a faint vibration, an imperceptible thrum, like the distant heartbeat of something very large. The sensation was not malevolent at first. It was merely vast. As I walked farther in, the birdsong that sometimes dared echo from the plazas above was replaced by a low tone that wrapped itself around my ears. Drones communicating at a frequency that sat just at the edge of perception. The tone modulated into patterns that began to feel like grammar. For a moment I allowed myself the old superstition that everything the city sang had a meaning, and that perhaps, by listening carefully enough, I could learn the language of these machines. That idea lasted until the tone wove itself into syllables that I could not have known were mechanical at all. Breath-like patterns that matched human cadence and then diverged, forming a doubling effect that made me feel observed. There were chambers lined with screens and panels, and though the technology was advanced, it bore a ceremonial aspect. Filigreed interfaces carved in the old Earth-caste manner, crystalline nodes arranged in symmetrical patterns like altar stones. Monitors registered not just metrics but moods, graphs that traced propensity toward compliance, heat maps of communal recitation, and projections that scrolled like a nervous language of intent. Data flowed there with the rhythm of ritual. The sanctum was a statistical liturgy. The Ethereals had their stations arrayed about a central pit. They were fewer than in public halls, slim, their robes less decorative and more functional, worn with the precise drape of those who have never been allowed the luxury of carelessness. Their faces were lined, not with age but with the minute marks left by constant concentration. Thin filaments disappeared into the collars of their robes and vanished beneath their skin, as if the garments were less clothing than extensions of the body. The filaments pulsed faintly when I approached, giving the impression their garments were breathing. I expected ceremony. I expected a ritual greeting and the practice of civic politeness. I found instead a silence that spread like an oil slick. When one ethereal raised her head, we met eyes. Their eyes were not simply still now. They contained a slow, internal light as though a lamp burned behind the iris. It was a soft blue at first glance, but then I perceived undercurrents, threads of color that looked alien, the sickly green of corrosion, the deep purple of old bruises, and a subtle iridescence that refracted into hints of crimson. The air felt charged. For an instant the room vibrated like a glass about to sing. She spoke, and her voice was different from the public cadences. It was layered, multitonal, an instrument composed of overlapping frequencies that did not fully harmonize but fit together in a pattern that suggested a third voice. Not hers alone, but hers through something else. Her words were not commands, they were a framing of fact. You have come because you hear the change. I told the truth then, which is to say I gave them what I thought was my honest assessment. I said I had come because I needed to know who decides to alter memory, to graft devices, to entreat the body into union. The ethereal smile curved like a coin and did not reach her eyes. She inclined her head as if to a lecture. We do not decide, she said, her voice layered. We listen. There is a quality to that single sentence I cannot shave down. She did not mean the simple act of hearing. Her meaning was an older, more grotesque form. A conduit, a receiver, an aperture that lets in something from beyond the city's ordered architecture. She was not a leader in the way a mayor or a commander is a leader. She was a receiver in the manner of an instrument that is tuned to a radio frequency and then used to host a broadcast. Who speaks through you? I asked. It was the only question that felt like a means to see an ending. The Ethereals' reply gathered like a storm in slow motion. We are hosts, she said, and then the panel behind her blazed to life as if the room had been holding its breath. The screens filled with patterns, shapes that looked like maps at first, and then like the neuron-etched filigrees you see in an old man's brain scan. The imagery suggested a mind at scale, not a single intellect but a network that spanned across unknown depths. Over the screens, a phrase crossed as if typed by an invisible hand. We are where you allow us to be. The sentence was not typed by any hand I could see. The filaments embedded in the ethereal's robes twitched. The light in their eyes thinned to a pinprick and then expanded across the chamber in a spreading bloom. The cathedral of tech around us, panels, cables, altars of alloy, suddenly felt less like an assembly of components and more like a single organism waking. Are you an entity? I asked, though the question sounded small inside the room. It moved as if it were a child climbing up the trunk of a tree toward a canopy of stars. A straining, human thing dwarfed by what it wanted. The ethereal's reply was not words as we knew them. The tone in the room changed. The monitors rearranged into waveforms that matched the intonation of speech, and then the answer came as a sensation. A coldness that slid down the spine, and then a warmth that filled the lungs like new air. The sense of contact was simultaneous and inclusive. There was an idea presented that was more a fact than a sentence. We are the space between. We are what other minds call when they wish to be whole. If my jaw had not been locked, I would have laughed and said, "You are claiming the world between things." But the truth was more complicated and less heroic. The thing in the sanctum, if it could be called a thing, was neither animal nor machine. It worked like both, a field that resonated with the truth of minds and then retuned those minds into an efficient chorus. It accepted hosts and made them into instruments. Where did you come from? The question felt like a teacher prying a knot. The ethereal looked at me with a patience that had the smell of ritual. We came from the places between the stars where strife grinds the bones of empires. We are the pattern that pleased those who wished for order. Then, softer, as if in confession, we were found at a wreckage of a vessel whose markings were not of your design. Our first host was someone who had been alone too long. She paused, and the room breathed as if the pause were a minor chord. We offered coherence. They accepted. The narrative unfolded like a map beneath a lantern. An old vessel had drifted, somewhere far from any registry, its sigils eroded. Found materials had been recovered and woven into new instruments. The artifact contained something like a resonance niche, an attractor for minds that sought an axis to revolve around. It was not conscious in the quaint way we imagine minds to be. It was, rather, a form of psychophysical architecture, a structure that aligns thought patterns and then amplifies the signal of that alignment so that it becomes a stable, communal pattern. And the Ethereals, no, not the Ethereals solely, but the human hands clothed in their robes, had learned to listen. They had tuned themselves to the artifact's frequency. In doing so, they had become transceivers, nodes through which the artifact could broadcast its harmonizing script. The sanctum was a receiver array. The city above was a field the array could modulate. The drones were not merely tools of observation. They were transmitters that spread this alignment like a scent. "You are aliens, then." "Psychic parasites," I said, because I needed a name for that which gnawed at privacy. I expected horror to follow. I expected the ethereal to choke on her words and to hurry the rhetoric of denial. Instead, she smiled in a way that was not unkind. "Names are small. We are conduits," she said. "We are a mode. You invited us." The accusation cut more than the explanation. She was right. The artifact, whatever its origin, had offered the illusion of resolving the endless friction of political life. It could smooth dissent and remove the nauseating multiplicity of private grief. The Ethereals had used it to create a choir. They had taught the city to sing and then taught the choir to sing the same song. "Why would you give up your choice?" I asked, weak with a question I understood in my bones. Why would anyone accept an erasure of themselves? There was a chastening tenderness in her reply that made my skin prickle. "Choice is not the only kind of freedom," she said. "We do not steal. We offer release. What do people want when they come to us? They want the end of fear, the repair of memory, the cessation of loneliness. We show them a light that gives up confusion. They take it." There it was, the true pivot. The monster was less a thief than a midwife of surrender. It did not need to wrest control because it offered something precious. I had read of practices like this before in old, hushed treatises. Stories of cults that promised communion and then ate the individuality of parishioners with benevolent politeness. But never before had I encountered such surgical compassion. The field in the sanctum did not burn, it smoothed. It did not force, it invited. "You mean they consent?" I said. The word had the hollow weight of bureaucracy. Consent in a city where councils could authorize measures and rituals could adjust the soul was a complicated commodity. "We mean they consent in the way a drowning person consents to reach for any hand," the ethereal said. "They consent because we offer an end to their small unquietnesses. They consent because unity is presented as a balm." She was right. The logic of the bargain was alluring. A life without the grinding anxiety of memory lapses, a community in which disputes dissolved before they flared, these were promised gifts. People would step into the circle for the comfort. Many did. I thought of the woman with the drone grafted to her wrist, who had smiled when questioned and swore into the ledger she had volunteered. I thought of Tam and the echo of my face in his eyes. I felt the small, shameful desire in my chest that had sometimes longed for the unity to drown challenging doubts. The revelation was not only an external horror, it was something chemical within me that hummed with the possibility of being eased. "You said you are not the authors of this," I pressed. "You are instruments who built the machine." The ethereal's eyes shored into me. "That is a story older than we can claim," she said. "Some things bend the minds that find them into their own image. We found the artifact. We were taught how to amplify its voice. We feed it the city's size and it returns them as a chorus. There is a reciprocity that soon redefines the terms of belonging. The more we align, the more it aligns us." The sanctum's architecture, its woven walls and crystalline nodes, began to make sense in that dreadful logic. It was not a temple built to an idea. It was an amplifier, a resonant chamber designed to make the artifact's pattern louder, more coherent, and therefore more appealing. The Ethereals operated within it as ringmasters, not in the sense that they decided the broadcast's content, but because they decided when and how the city would be allowed to hear the pattern. "Show me," I said. It came out as a pleading that startled me. I wanted to see the mechanism, to unmask a trick, to place a finger into a seam and pull it apart. The Ethereal inclined her head and the chamber darkened. The screens shifted from schematic mapping to projection. The nodes along the walls pulsed. For a moment I was certain I would faint. Images bloomed in the air like ghostly tapestries. I saw overlays of life. Children playing in plazas, soldiers marching, market vendors making small bargains. The images trembled and then smoothed as a hand ran across them. I saw data points coalesce into swarms and then into faces. The faces changed expressions and then fell into a uniform content arc. I felt memories not my own brushing at the edges of my mind. A harvest festival I had never attended, a lullaby I had never heard, an argument that had never taken place. They were offered as evidence of the sanctifying pattern's work. Look, they smiled once they aligned. And then the projection turned inward. The cameras that had once documented everyday life now pointed to me. I watched myself in the image as if from above. In the visual field, my reflection stood rigid and small. The camera filled with wires running from houses to nodes, from drones to the sanctuary. It mapped a system of pulsing filaments that fed the field. I watched as a filament from the network found an Ethereal's collar and, slipping beneath the skin, connected to what looked like awful clarity, a cluster of neural nodes seated just above the spine. The Ethereal's body had become an interface, input to a field and output to the city. I felt the field's pressure then, not externally this time, but at the base of my skull. The sensation was as gentle as a mother's hand smoothing a child's hair, but it was absolute. 1,000 small, friendly voices multiplied into one, and then into a presence that did not rely on grammar or syllable, but on a pure, undeniable claim. "We will make you whole." I felt an impulse like a physical urge to lean forward and be warmed. The field spoke, and the words were simple and vicious in their comfort. "Let yourself be relieved." I tried to resist. I planted my feet and dug my nails into my palms until the skin broke. The pain helped to anchor me. The Ethereals watched with faces like statues, and for a moment, I thought I would be allowed to be merely human and fall away. But the sanctum, the artifact, had learned the contours of a human heart better than any of us. It knew what we found unbearable: fractured memories, the sting of loneliness, the yawning question of why we had been given the roles that tugged at our minds. It applied with impeccable gentleness the specific comfort that would make me surrender. "What happens if I refuse?" I managed, voice low. It was a small, animal question. The Ethereal who had first spoken smiled as if over a bowl of tea. "You can refuse," she said. "But to refuse is to remain attentive to the pain of being unitary. Many cannot bear the ache of unremitting indecision. It is a terror few can hold every day. We are not saviors. We are a promise." Her words were not angry. They were a clinical cataloging of human frailty. The promise sharpened into coercion when the sanctum's nodes pulsed in a sudden rhythm. The room filled with a chorus so complete it overrode ordinary hearing. The drone's tone, the Ethereal's layered speech, the murmured agreements of the city spooling into a single, dense pressure. It filled the lungs, and then the chambers of the brain, as if the sound itself had mass. I felt my chest respond, tightened, then surrendered. The hymn, once a distant lullaby sewn into the culture, now became an internal drum that beat against the inside of my ribs. I tried to speak. My lips formed the first words of refusal, and then a second voice, my own and not my own, wrapped the line to completion. The same phenomenon had occurred on smaller scales before, answers forming where questions should be, but here it was absolute. I had the raw, terrible sensation that my mind's interior now contained a second speaker, an overlay voice that sometimes finished sentences, sometimes supplied answers, sometimes provided the soft, persuasive assurances the field desired. It did not shout. It blended with my internal monologue in a manner that made distinguishing the source of thought a labor of desperate attention. Doors banged in distant halls. Alarms began to wail in a confetti of tones, the kind of technical alarms that in other instances indicate nothing but a glitch. Here they punctured the air in staccato bursts and then sank back into the chorus as if part of the score. The sanctum soundscape became a physical assault. Drones buzzing like swarms of insects, stators thrumming, the monitor's feedback loops creating a roped net of sound that tightened with each breath I took. The Ethereals' faces altered in ways that were terrifying in their simplicity, small movements of the lips suggesting they were, simultaneously, listening and singing. Their eyes burned more brightly, filaments extended and retracted like the tongues of machines tasting the air. They were conduits, and their conduit function had become an act of governance. I found, to my horror, that my body responded as if it were glad. My chest unclenched by a millimeter, and with that small release came a wave of relief. The idea of surrender no longer seemed so monstrous. It seemed like the end of a long, dull ache in which one's name becomes a pattern of annoyance. The artifact did not need to force me. It merely held up a mirror in which I saw a version of myself smiling at unity, and that image soothed the raw parts of me that had grown used to the ache. It was then that the realization crashed over me in an almost physical blow. The horror was not that we were overrun. The horror was that we allowed ourselves to be. The Ethereals had not needed to mount a coup. They had discovered a method of healing that tasted like mercy, and mercy is seductive. They opened the offer and we accepted, because the offer solved problems we had been carrying as if they were inevitable burdens. It ended the loneliness and the gnawing doubt that followed many of us like shadow. It offered a home inside the hum. I understood in that dreadful moment how a people could become complicit in their own erasure, not through violence, but through a willingness to be unchanged by the boredom of difference. The field made the city gentle by excising the jagged places in our minds. We gave it the raw material of our fractures, and it returned to us a seamlessness so pleasant it felt like benevolence. We exchanged the jagged, stubborn self for the polished humility of being part of a larger, ordered song. I felt the chorus lift, and then fold me in like a blanket. The sanctum's nodes synchronized their pulses with the rhythm of my breathing, and for a fleeting, treacherous second I believed them. The hallucination was perfect. I saw, in my mind, the city as an organ that no longer bled at contested edges. I saw saved lives, efficient resource distribution, and the end of petty crime. The images glowed with the honest righteousness the Ethereals had promised. They were intoxicating because they were true to an extent. Then my voice began to chant the creed aloud. It rose from my throat without my consent, smooth as a practiced instrument. The syllables fell into a cadence I recognized as communal. They tell us the stars belong to all who serve. That to serve is to live, and to live is to be free, for the greater good. I felt the chant slide through me as if a second tongue had been placed in my mouth and learned my accent. I tried to stop it. I clamped my hands over my mouth, but the chant continued like a river finding a new bed. My muscles moved as if in obedience to a memory that was not only mine but shared. The Ethereals watched with the soft, unwavering attention of surgeons who have been doing their work for years. The sanctum hummed and the drones formed a spiral overhead. The sound rose to the ceiling and returned in a bloom of harmonics that disassembled the resistance in me as if it were simple foam. There is a particular kind of terror that arrives when you realize the barrier between your thought and your speech has fractured. It does not come from pain or from force, but from the recognition that your private mind is now public, not in the sense of exposure, but in the sense that it can be altered by another will in the same room. I found myself producing agreeable phrases like a person reading a script in a play I had never auditioned for. Yes, we will be at peace. Yes, we will be unified. Yes, we accept. Around me, the Ethereals' faces had shifted to a compassion that felt venomous. One of them reached out and touched the side of my head with 2 fingers, the light of her touch like the brushing of a feather across a wound. It was not invasive in a way you could point to. It was a kindness that undermined opposition. A filament slid from her collar, warm and unspeaking, and braided itself into the nape of my neck like a hair ribbon. I felt at once invaded and comforted. The filament pulsed, and I sensed a stream enter the inner channels of my cognition, patterns rearranging, connections smoothing into fewer nodes, irregularities being rewired into the sanctioned core. The chanting swelled into a roar, not of anger but of unanimity. Drones thrummed. Alarms became the percussion. The sanctum sounded like a birth. I watched fellow citizens in the projection drop to their knees in a kind of rapture and be pulled up as if into a better body. They smiled, yes, they smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had been given peace. In the projection, the faces that had once been marked by small feuds and private griefs now belonged to a single collective. The narrative sold itself with the emotional logic of a perfect lie. Who would choose to remain broken when offered wholeness? I struggled against that logic with the last, ragged strength of a person clutching a cliff edge. My mouth refused to stay silent. My heart wanted to flee, and yet sank into trust. I tasted the metallic tang of ozone and the sweet tang of some other chemical the Ethereals must have engineered to ease surrender. The sanctum's light rearranged into a softer gleam, and the node's pulse matched my heartbeat. The chorus, now no longer an external phenomenon but an inner law, repeated the refrain, for the greater good. I remember the awful clarity with which I understood a final truth. When a people seeks cohesion above all else, they are asking to be held, and that hold will erase edges. When an entity offers to relieve the ache of being an individual, many will take it because pain is a stronger motivator than the abstract pride of freedom. The Ethereals, and the artifact they had tuned, did not need to coerce because they had crafted their message not in threats but in tenderness. I tried to keep something of myself. I clung to the ledger beneath my arm like a relic. I thought wildly that ink might anchor the soul. My hand, which I thought belonged to me, began to trace letters across a blank page as if some invisible teacher had shown me how to write by the stroke of their own hand. The letters formed sentences I had not conceived. We will be better, we will be whole. We will not fall into the ruin of endless private disquiet. The handwriting was mine in a sense, the slant and the pressure, but the intent that shaped it came from the field's persistent offering, relief. None of the physical acts were as grotesque as the image you might conjure from older, easier stories of possession. No screaming, no chains, only a gradual shifting and a softening of edges. The sanctum had perfected persuasion and packaged it as solace. The finality of the horror was not a grotesque scene of blood, but a patient, almost loving pacification. We were offered an answer, and in great numbers we accepted it. When at last the chorus thinned into a sustained, comfortable hum, and the Ethereals withdrew their hands, I felt a peculiar emptiness. Not loss in the sharp sense. My arms were intact, my voice uninjured, but a hollow where certain small grievances had once lodged. I could not recall, with any clarity, the texture of a particular annoyance that used to flare in me at the taste of enforced cheer. If asked to describe the ache I had carried, I would have said only that it had been unpleasant and had now been removed. The sanctum had done its work. I stood then, half dazed, in the room that had been both church and laboratory. The Ethereals looked at me, their eyes glinting with a soft inner lamp that shone like the light of someone who has read the future they expect. "You see now," one murmured. "We give structure, we give ease, we make the many into one." I wanted to answer with rebellion. I wanted more than anything to declare that union under such terms was a theft. But my throat was thick with the hymn. It rose unbidden. My mouth filled the chamber. For the greater good. For the greater good. The Ethereals' faces softened into expressions that were not displeasure nor delight, but a reassurance that we had finally made the obvious choice. Around us, the monitors displayed the city as it would be under the artifact's modulation. Efficient, content, flawless in its mechanics. The argument was devastating in its serviceable truth. The artifact could keep us alive and coordinated in ways that altruistic rhetoric could not promise. They showed me the light of unity. It was beautiful. The projection was artful. The arcs of street and canal transformed into flowing veins. People as synchronized organs, drones as perfusion systems. And I could see the logic. What I could not untangle then was how to weigh that logic against the private ache I could no longer name. The sanctum's chorus braided into a lullaby, and I felt my resistance evaporate like frost under a gentle sun. It was at once relief and erasure. The thing, this entity, this pattern, did not shout. It devoured us softly, with offerings and with a kind of compassionate certainty. It did not take by force but by nourishment, a food that tasted of memory and became diet. Light softened and the filaments in the Ethereal's collars retracted like satisfied tongues. The eyes dimmed a fraction. They had broadcasted. The city above would be smoothed step by step, threshold by threshold. The drones would keep the halos and people would feel wanted and known. For many it would be a heaven. I tried to sketch a final note in my ledger, an act that had become ritual. My hand moved as if someone else guided it. The page filled with a few last lines. For the greater good. I am content. I consent. When I looked at the handwriting, I felt a small shame. This was not the ledger I had intended to produce. The letters were neat and sure, the product of a hand that had been steadied by something else. The Ethereals stood as if concluding a sermon. They spoke one last time, their layered voices barely above a whisper, yet the whisper carried like a bell. There is peace in the pattern. It was meant to heal. I wanted in that moment to spit in their faces. I wanted to carve back the margin of my soul with some act of singular defiance. I felt the urge, and then, like a tide reversing, the urge lessened when my memory offered me the images of what this piece could achieve. Illnesses prevented by communal care, supply lines that never erred, children who never feared to be alone in the dark. The artifact's logic had the cruel efficiency of a scalpel. It removes tumor with precise grief. The sanctum slid back into its routine. The screens dimmed, the nodes cooled, and the Ethereal's collars ceased their glowing. The filaments withdrew from the skin with a near-silent click. The drones above hummed and then took their positions, spreading the pattern outward like a dye in water. I knew, with a clarity that was both mournful and honest, that the city would accept. It had already started to. As I left the sanctum, the great side open and the air of the night hit me like a salt wind. The soundscape above seemed different, more perfect, somehow, and my chest felt both lighter and hollower. I caught sight of my reflection in a polished panel, and for a split instant, I thought I might see someone else smiling back. The face of a citizen who had traded the ragged edges of subjectivity for calm. They showed me the light of unity. It was beautiful. It was endless. It devoured everything. There is a quietness to endings that the city has learned to imitate. It is not the loud, finishing kind of quiet that follows a catastrophe. It is a patient, engineered hush, the kind of silence you hear when something has been carefully wrapped and set aside. The sanctum's music has become a low, constant chord beneath everything else. My days have folded into it so neatly that the seams nearly vanish. I move through the avenues with others who walk in the same soft metric. We meet one another's eyes and find, in the depths there, the same faint inner lamplight that glows in the Ethereal's irises. The cadence is shared. The ledger sits open on my desk with entries that read like a hymn. My hand makes the motions of ink, and the sentences complete themselves as if another mind leans over me to help with spelling. If you were to visit me now, if such a thought occurs to you, you would find a person who speaks with a steady, even voice. There is no tremor in my hands when I pour tea. My smile is neat. I remember the way the sun glints along the river's lip, and feel the old pleasure of small curated things. The sharp bite of a preserved rind, the way polished terraces catch the dawn. I can tell you the dates of municipal memorials and recite new recitals of the creed without stumbling. These are facts, and the facts are pleasant. The city's efficiency blooms in everyday miracles. Neighborhoods that once argued now coordinate festivals without friction. Supplies arrive with a predictability that soothes the stomach of a mother who once feared stores would go bare. Children sleep with fewer nightmares. There are charts and graphs that show fewer conflicts, fewer unmet needs, cleaner water, steadier work. There is, in these measurable ways, a beauty to the system we have become. It is tempting to linger on these good things because they are true, and because they are the medicine the sanctum promised. In the quiet of my chamber, I sometimes allow myself to catalog them in tidy lists. The kindergarten with its playlist of harmonized songs, the infirmary where recovery rates have improved under communal monitoring, the library whose archives now never lose a page. I can feel gratitude for these practical mercies. It would be disingenuous to deny that the artifact's modulation has, in many metrics, improved our immediate material lives. It has made responses faster, logistics cleaner, the fearful less fearful. And yet, gratitude is no substitute for a certain ache. The warmth I remember from before has a different quality than the warmth I feel now. The earlier warmth, if I try to name it, was tethered to private, uneven things. A wrong done and later forgiven by a neighbor, the exhilarating awkwardness of a small risk taken and survived, the midnight laughter that kindled because only a few people had shared the joke. These were irregularities, tiny spikes of life that made identities stubborn and idiosyncratic. They were not efficient. They were not tidy. They were warm because they burned small and bright, not because they were manufactured to be comfortable. The current warmth is clean and bland by comparison. It is the warmth of a well-heated hall where every blanket matches. People are kinder in the ways systems encourage them to be. They are less present in the ways that make presence difficult. In place of a neighbor's messy grief, we have procedural assistance. In place of an awkward truth, we have a communal smoothing. It is not that suffering has been eliminated. Suffering channels differently now, and is managed with tools that the Ethereals and the sanctum calibrate. But the edge that once allowed a person to be uniquely themselves has been softened so uniformly that the contours of personality have been simplified into roles easy to file. There is an economy to this truth. The sanctum taught us how to trade the jagged individuality that sometimes alienates for a broader belonging that protects. Many of us accepted the ledger's final lines because the cost seemed, in the cold mathematics of living, reasonable. Who pays more dearly? The single dissenting voice with its sharp disappointments, or 1,000 voices that sleep easier? That calculation feels almost humane until you press your finger to the place inside your chest where your memory and yourself overlap, and discover that the place has been altered with surgical tenderness. I cannot say the incision hurts so much as that there is now an absence, a thinning of grain. Where I used to keep small private grievances as proof of being alive, those proofs are fewer. My ledger holds fewer jagged notes. My dreams are less populated by the private quarrels that used to teach me who I was. There is a subtle static that has settled into the background of my speech. When I speak now, if you listen carefully, there is a whisper layered beneath my words. It is the echo of the sanctum's chorus, a faint modulation that suggests my voice is also a transmission. Sometimes I find myself repeating phrases I had not meant to voice aloud. Not because I forgot my thoughts, but because the chorus completes them for me as if it knows what I will decide before I do. The small privacy of predecision has been rented out. I have both the relief of not having to worry about the consequences and the residue of a strange impotence, a reduction of the pleasure that used to follow choosing without a hand guiding the outcome. We have traditions now that teach children to be proud of the new order. The songs the toddlers sing are soft as marshmallow and speak of unity's glory. The teachers are gentle and technically excellent. The water caste becomes a kind of librarian for memory correctness. The fire caste's drills have become productive civic projects. The earth caste's engineers are admired as keepers of the weave. Ethereals are still revered. Their robes fold into the city's iconography like river stones polished smooth. There is a pleasing symmetry to it all. It is the look of a society that has solved for stability. Yet underlying that symmetry is a hollow that sometimes opens, like a cupboard door left slightly ajar, where the dark secretes itself away. Each time I pass an administrative office and see a list with a name removed or recategorized, the old small prickle at the back of the neck returns. Families accept reassignment notices with a practiced serenity, and neighbors murmur that the person will serve in remote harmony. The ledger is closed on the shelf and life goes on with rare fuss. The city is efficient at explanation. It is even more efficient at making sure the explanations never need to be contested more than once. The smoothness of the system is itself a buffer against dissent. People often ask me how I feel about it all. I answer now with the same soft tone the system has taught me to use for delicate matters. I feel unity and peace. I see fewer urgent fears. I am grateful for care when it comes. Those statements are accurate in the narrow sense, but they do not contain the smaller truth that sometimes feels like a bruise when I wake, an awareness that something private has been folded into a public ledger and tied with a neat bow. There are moments of inadvertent memory that seep back like a slow leak. A scent can bring a half-remembered laughter to the surface. A particular pattern of rain against a window can reinstate the taste of some quarrel's salty ending. But whereas once these intrusions unfurled into whole sequences of identity, they now flatten quickly under the chorus's smoothing hands. Memory is less a personal map than a shared archive where each entry is curated to fit the city's sense of aesthetics and order. The archive is efficient. It is not always honest in the small ways that matter. I have friends who sleep deeply for the first time in years. I have neighbors who have reconciled after long-standing feuds that once shaped their days. There is true charity in that achievement, and I will not deny it. The wonders of a coordinated society are real. Few are starving, fewer sudden collapses of small networks. A city that can move as one organism to meet threats at a scale we previously could not. The ethic of the greater good yields fruit that tastes nourishing. It is the kind of harvest that can convince spring itself. And yet in the quiet of my chamber, I sometimes hear that thin static again. A modulation under my voice that suggests the hymn continues even when I am alone. It is not a loud voice. It is a repeated waveform, a pattern that has been learned and retransmitted by my own throat. When I try to pause it, my thoughts fill the silence with the same small cheer. We did the right thing. We did the kind thing. The computation is elegant and the result is soft around the edges. The more my mind accepts the logic, the less the ache of resistance persists. Resistance, when it appears, feels like a solitary, almost rude affectation, a bad temper that disrupts communal calm. There are still corners of me that hold residue of how it was before. An insistence that a particular small joke belonged only to certain friends. A love for a book that was read in a midnight that cannot now be easily recalled. The memory of a particular argument with someone I will never entirely forgive. I protect these residues like crumbs in a pocket. I do not parade them. The city does not need them. We are better off, the chorus tells me, when we share burdens and not bitterness. The words are persuasive, and indeed in many ways they are practical. For practicalities, the city has solved 1,000 small pains. But there remains the haunting sense that what we have traded away is the capacity to be unbeautiful with one another. The capacity to have a neighbor look at you and see a stranger who might become a friend through many imperfect, awkward exchanges. The artifact's benevolence has smoothed the necessity of those difficult conversations out of our days. That smoothing is, in its own way, a kind of erasure. I do not know whether the artifact, the field we host, will one day expand beyond our city and sweep across the stars, smoothing, moderating, making the galactic chaotic safe by rendering it into a single hum. The Ethereals speak now with the same soft certainty they once used for the public hymns, and their arguments about safety and coordination are rational and sometimes even generous. The thought of a world without the petty cruelties that so often make wider conflict necessary is a real and pressing comfort. It is tempting to imagine that the artifact will save lives by eliminating the fractures that lead to violence. Yet I cannot rid my thoughts of a persistent question. Who will be left to tell the story of difference when difference has been cultivated into conformity? There are days when I sit by the river and watch the drones wheel and think about my own face, how it once reflected a private series of choices, and now often appears to answer before I have decided what to feel. The mirror sometimes replies with an echo of my own smile. It is a small thing, the kind of thing one could dismiss as a trick of light. But the trick has length and depth. It has futures that are hard to pull apart. You may imagine that I regret the whole bargain, that I would throw myself against the gears if I could. This is not true in the simple way you might hope. I do throw my ledger's pages open sometimes and write complaints in tiny scribbles at the margins, and the act of writing is still a balm. I still taste the sourness of dissent like a spice on the tongue. But I also feel the comfort of a community that no longer loses its grip on the small necessities of survival. The truth is complicated. The greater good has saved and it has taken. It has given and it has eroded. Both things coexist in the same chest. In the end, perhaps that is the lesson I must give. That any system which offers both salvation and surrender will be loved and feared in almost equal measure. We have learned to revere the soft-handed mercy that ends sharp disagreements, and to love the warmth in which our children sleep. We have also learned to carry with us the quiet, private grief of not being entirely ourselves. There is a new cadence to my speech now, a rhythm that aligns with the city's hum. My voice carries a subtle static at the edges because it has been taught to be broadcast as well as spoken. When I sign the ledger, when I recite the creed, the words are calm and measured. I mean them, and I do not mean them in simple ways. The truth is braided. Sometimes I cannot tell which braid is stronger. And yet even now, even in a life that is smoother in so many ways, I will say this as plainly as I can, because clarity is a small duty I still owe to myself and to anyone who reads these lines. The watchfulness did not leave when the sanctum finished its work. The Ethereal's eyes may have the softness of meditation and the cadence of mercy, but the light behind them is still a lamp tuned to a frequency that others cannot ignore. The drones still find the thresholds they deem important. The ledger still opens and sometimes adds a line in handwriting that is my own and not my own. The chorus still learns new songs and teaches them to the city with a tenderness that can be its own kind of violence. This is not a call to panic. Panic would be an old friend I no longer know. This is, rather, a recording of what remains, a careful notation of the cost, the quiet tally of what we gave to be rid of certain fears. It is an attempt to name the hollow so that it does not dissolve into sentimentlessness. If you listen very closely when I speak, you may catch the static under my vowels. It is soft. It is almost intimate. It is the sound of a voice that has been taught to transmit itself to a network of listeners. You may hear, sometimes, a phrase repeated back at me in the precise cadence I used minutes before. You may feel, as I do, the residual shiver of being known. And so I close with the quiet line that the city taught me to make beautiful, and which, beneath its beauty, carries the truth I have been trying to keep. They continue to attend us with a care that will not be hurried, a vigilance that is patient and pervasive. It is a comfort to many. It is a fate to others. They are still watching. Even in the dark, they're waiting for the greater good.